The candles burned low in the stone chamber. Outside, winter clawed at the walls of the fortress like something desperate to get in. Inside, a 12-year-old girl stood motionless as her attendants dressed her in white linen, their whispered prayers merging into a single, continuous hum that she could barely hear over the pounding of her own heart. The year was 1396, deep in the frozen heart of France, and what was about to happen to this child would be recorded in royal ledgers, medical journals, and church archives for the next 600 years. Not as a crime, but as a ceremony, not as cruelty, but as duty. Her name was Isabelle of Valois, and tonight she would become a living treaty between two kingdoms. But the price of that peace would be paid in ways history has tried very hard to forget. This is not a ghost story. This is not legend or folklore whispered around campfires. Every detail you're about to hear comes from actual medieval documents, physicians' reports, and diplomatic correspondence that still exists today, preserved in archives across Europe. What happened to Isabelle wasn't hidden in shadows or lost to time. It was written down, signed, witnessed, and sanctioned by the most powerful institutions of the age. The church blessed it, kings commanded it, doctors supervised it, and when it was over, they called it a success. Because in the world of medieval politics, a child's suffering was a small price to pay for peace, and they made absolutely certain that suffering would be thorough, documented, and impossible to deny. Isabelle was the daughter of Charles VI of France, a king whose mind was slowly unraveling into madness, and Queen Isabel of Bavaria, who understood that daughters were currency in the Game of Thrones. From the moment Isabelle drew her first breath, her destiny had been written by men she would never meet, negotiated in languages she barely understood, for purposes that had nothing to do with her happiness or her humanity. She was raised in silks and ceremony, taught to obey, to smile, to become whatever shape the crown required of her. And when England and France finally grew tired of decades of bloodshed, when both kingdoms looked for a way to stop the killing without admitting defeat, they found their solution in a child's body. Her husband would be King Richard II of England. He was 29 years old, nearly 3 times her age, already hollowed out by grief from losing his first queen, Anne of Bohemia. The chroniclers say he resisted at first, that the thought of marrying a 12-year-old filled him with something close to shame. But kings don't have the luxury of conscience when treaties demand sacrifice. The contract was signed, the betrothal announced, and Isabelle was sent across the channel into a foreign realm that had no intention of treating her like a child. The wedding took place in November, surrounded by all the pageantry two kingdoms could muster. Banners fluttered in the cold wind, church bells rang across the countryside, nobles exchanged jewels and promises, and both nations celebrated what they called a miracle. Peace at last, sealed by marriage, blessed by God. But when the music faded and the guests departed, when the goblets were emptied and the halls fell silent, the real ritual began. Because for a royal marriage to be considered legitimate, for the treaty to be unbreakable, the union had to be proven beyond any possible doubt. Not just consummated, but verified. Not just once, but repeatedly. Not in privacy, but under observation. This was the custom they called the extended bedding, and for Isabelle, it would last 7 days and 7 nights. 7 days during which her childhood would be methodically dismantled by physicians, priests, and protocol. 7 nights during which her body would become a legal document, written on by men who claimed they were serving God and country. If you're drawn to the darkest corners of real history, to the stories that textbooks tried to bury, consider subscribing. Because what we're about to uncover goes far deeper than most people want to believe. Isabelle was led through torch-lit corridors to the bedchamber, her small hands clutching a rosary her attendants had pressed into her palm. Her veil trembled as she walked, not from wind, but from the shaking of her entire body. At the door, her ladies withdrew with lowered eyes, and guards took their positions in the hallway. Inside, King Richard waited, and when the door closed behind her, the chroniclers fell silent. Not because medieval scribes were modest, these same men recorded executions and tortures in excruciating detail, but because what happened next was considered too sacred to necessary to bound up with matters of state to be described in plain language. But the administrative records tell us everything we need to know. Physicians entered the chamber twice daily for 7 consecutive days. They brought instruments, writing materials, and instructions from both courts. Their job was to examine, to confirm, to document that the marriage was being properly fulfilled according to the requirements of international law. But what happened next will shock even those who think they understand medieval brutality. The physician's reports still exist, written in clinical Latin, signed and sealed, filed away in the archives of Westminster Abbey and the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. They describe a process so methodical, so coldly bureaucratic, that it reads more like a scientific experiment than anything resembling a wedding night. The doctors arrived at scheduled intervals, determined by astrological calculations and church-approved timing. They examined Isabel between each session, checking for what they called signs of union, looking for physical evidence that the marriage was being consummated properly. They recorded her pulse, her coloring, her emotional state. One entry notes that she showed nervous trembling at intervals, appetite reduced, complexion pale, but sound. That final word, sound, meaning she survived, is perhaps the most chilling detail in the entire archive, because survival was all that mattered. Her pain, her fear, her tears, those were expected, even desirable. Medieval medicine believed that a woman's distress during the act was actually proof of her purity, evidence that she was an innocent being initiated into womanhood. The physicians believed, wrongly but sincerely, that conception required the woman's pleasure, that her body had to release its own seed for pregnancy to occur, and so they prescribed what they called the full course, 7 days of repeated attempts to ensure that nature would take hold. Servants brought meals according to schedules designed to balance the humors. Candles burned without pause so the doctors could observe at any hour. Priests stood outside the door reciting prayers meant to sanctify what was happening inside. And through it all, Isabel endured, because she had no choice, because in her world, this was not abuse, it was policy, not torture, but treaty. French envoys stationed at the English court wrote letters home throughout that week. Their correspondence, still preserved in the French National Archives, is haunting in its calmness. They mention that the marriage was properly concluded according to custom, that every measure had been observed as required by both crowns. There is no mention of the child at the center of it all, no acknowledgement of suffering or fear. Only diplomatic satisfaction that the alliance was secure, that the paperwork was complete, that 2 kingdoms could now move forward with confidence. The final physician's report contains a Latin phrase that appears in several royal marriage documents from this era, testificatum est unio perfecta. It is testified, the union is complete, signed by 3 doctors, witnessed by 2 bishops, and filed alongside the treaty itself as legal proof that the peace between England and France was now consummated in every sense of the word. When the 7th day ended, Isabel emerged from that chamber fundamentally changed. Attendants described her as pale as parchment, speaking barely above a whisper, her eyes hollow and distant. She had survived, but something essential had been extracted from her, something that could never be returned. And despite everything, despite all the rituals and examinations and physicians' notes claiming success, Isabel did not conceive. Her body was too young, her frame too fragile, her womb not yet developed enough for pregnancy. The doctors blamed the timing, the stars, her diet, anything except the fundamental horror of what they had done. And so the kingdoms announced that the marriage had been fulfilled, the alliance secured, and moved on as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. King Richard's behavior afterward became the subject of quiet speculation. He withdrew from Isabel almost completely, granting her chambers, attendants, jewels, everything except his presence. Some historians believe guilt consumed him, that he sought confession and performed private penances for what he had been compelled to do. Others suggest the ritual only deepened his existing coldness, that he saw her as a reminder of duties that had cost him whatever remained of his humanity. Whatever the truth, they never shared a bed again. When Richard was overthrown 3 years later by Henry Bolingbroke, when he died imprisoned in Pontefract Castle, Isabel was barely 13 years old, widowed before reaching womanhood. The French crown demanded her return, but she remained in England for 2 more years, a political hostage with a queen's title and a prisoner's reality. When she finally returned to France at 15, witnesses described her stepping ashore silent and pale, her hands clasped as though still bound by invisible chains. She lived quietly with her mother, rarely appearing in public, reportedly sleeping each night with a candle burning beside her bed, terrified of darkness and locked doors. At 16, she married again, this time to Charles of Orleans, a young nobleman closer to her own age. In this marriage, she bore children, found moments of peace, even learned to laugh again. But those who knew her said she carried a silence that never lifted, the stillness of someone who had once been turned into evidence. Isabel died at 20. Her body weakened by childbirth and what the records vaguely call constitutional frailty. In death, artists remade her into something she never was in life, painting her serene and saintly, surrounded by angels. They made her gentle again, as if beauty could erase what had been done. Her story faded into the margins of history, a footnote in treaties, a name on marriage registers. But the documents remain, locked in archives across Europe, telling a truth that civilization tried to bury beneath ceremony and Latin and the language of law. What happened to Isabel of Valois was not unique. Similar rituals appear in records from Aragon, Castile, and Burgundy. Noble brides observed by physicians and priests, their privacy obliterated for political certainty. This was how power worked in a world where peace was more valuable than mercy, where the bodies of girls became the ink in which treaties were written. We want to believe we've evolved beyond such horrors, that we've built something better. But every time we look away from suffering because it serves a larger purpose, every time we sacrifice the vulnerable for the sake of stability, we light those same candles again, we close that same door. We write those same reports in different language, pretending that necessity makes it noble. Drop a comment below. Tell us what you think about how far we've really come, or if the names and rituals have simply changed while the cruelty remains the same. Because Isabel's story isn't just about the past. It's about what we're still willing to ignore when power demands it. The candles are still burning. The question is whether we're brave enough to look at what they illuminate,